My name is Marcus Young. I'm 31 years old, and this is the story of the most expensive grounding in West Coast corporate history. 3 nights ago, in front of 38 guests at his anniversary party, my father pointed at me and said something that would destroy his career. "You're grounded until you apologize to my wife." People laughed. A grown man being grounded like a child. I didn't argue. I just said, "All right." But 72 hours later, at the biggest contract signing of his life, with 180 executives and investors watching, the lead attorney suddenly stopped the signing and asked, "Before we proceed, where is the CTO of Apex Systems? We need his signature under Clause 6. 2. That's when my father turned pale, because I was already walking in, security badge visible, and his $42 million deal was about to disappear. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you are watching from. Now let me take you back to the moment he thought humiliating me in public was safe. The anniversary party wasn't about love. It never was. It was about optics. Crystal glasses, catered food, a rented venue overlooking the bay, and carefully selected guests, board members, senior engineers, investors, people whose opinions mattered to my father more than mine ever had. His wife stood beside him all night like a trophy he kept polishing, correcting servers, interrupting conversations, smiling only when someone important was watching. I had been invited late, intentionally, not because they wanted me there, but because it looked strange if the founder's son and CTO didn't show up. I arrived, congratulated them, kept my head down, and planned to leave quietly. That was the mistake. Quiet makes people like my father uncomfortable. Silence feels like defiance to men who need noise to feel powerful. At some point, she made a comment about my attitude, something vague enough to sound reasonable, but sharp enough to draw blood. I didn't respond. I never do. That's when she sighed loudly and said, "See, this is what I deal with. Disrespect, constantly." Heads turned. Glasses paused midair, and my father saw an opportunity. He tapped his fork against his glass, smiled like a man about to teach a lesson, and said it loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Marcus won't be joining us for a while. He's grounded until he apologizes to my wife." Laughter rippled across the room. Not cruel laughter, worse, awkward laughter, the kind people use to stay on the right side of power. I felt eyes on me, pity from some, amusement from others, and satisfaction from him. He expected a reaction. Anger, embarrassment, begging, anything to confirm that he still controlled me. Instead, I nodded and said, "All right." That single word confused him. You could see it in his face. Control only works when the other person plays their role. I picked up my jacket, thanked a few people, and left. No argument. No apology. No scene. What my father didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Apex Systems wasn't just his company anymore. On paper, yes, he was the founder and CEO. But functionally, operationally, legally, the company ran through me. 2 years earlier, during a restructuring he barely read because he trusted his lawyers too much, I was named Chief Technology Officer with autonomous signing authority on all infrastructure, security, and compliance clauses. Clause 6. 2 was one of those. That clause existed for a reason. It was a safeguard required by the international investment group funding the deal. Any CTO signature missing or withdrawn invalidated the entire agreement. No extensions. No proxies. No exceptions. And 3 nights earlier, when he grounded me, he also revoked my internal access verbally, in front of witnesses, including 2 board members, including one legal consultant who took notes. So when he told me not to come in, I didn't. I stayed home. I didn't log in. I didn't sign anything. I didn't answer calls. I simply followed instructions. Which is why, 72 hours later, when the lead attorney stopped the signing and asked where I was, the room froze. My father tried to laugh it off. "He'll be here in a moment." The attorney shook his head. "He's not on the building access list. Security says his credentials were revoked." That's when I walked in. No rush. No smile. Badge visible. Calm. Professional. Every head turned. My father looked at me like he was seeing a ghost. His wife's face went tight, like someone realizing too late they'd pulled the wrong thread. I sat down, placed the folder on the table, and looked directly at the attorney. "I'm here," I said. "But before I sign anything, I need clarification." The room held its breath. And that's when my father realized that grounding me didn't make me smaller. It made him powerless. And we hadn't even reached the best part yet. The clarification I asked for wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, and it wasn't emotional. It was the kind of sentence that makes lawyers sit straighter in their chairs. I said, before I sign under Clause 6. 2. I need confirmation that my access, authority, and role have not been formally revoked by the board or documented through legal channels. The attorney blinked, then looked at my father, then back at me. To my knowledge, she said carefully, there is no documentation filed indicating removal or suspension of the CTO. I nodded, slowly, deliberately, then added, good, because 3 nights ago, in front of multiple witnesses, the CEO publicly announced that I was grounded and barred from company participation until I apologized to his spouse, which would qualify as an informal suspension tied to a personal demand, not a professional breach. You could feel the temperature in the room drop. Investors shifted. One of them leaned toward another and whispered. The word liability floated across the table like smoke. My father finally spoke, his voice tight, controlled, the way it gets when he knows he's losing ground but refuses to admit it. Marcus, this is not the place for family disagreements. I looked at him and said calmly, I agree, which is why it never should have been brought into the company. Silence. Heavy, surgical silence. The attorney cleared her throat and asked, are you stating that your signing authority may have been compromised by coercion or retaliation? I didn't raise my voice, didn't smile, didn't dramatize it. I'm stating that until my role is confirmed as independent of personal compliance demands, I cannot legally sign without exposing myself and this firm to risk. That word did it, risk. Investors don't care about ego, they care about exposure. One of the senior partners from the investment group leaned forward and said, we were assured Apex Systems had clear governance separation. Another asked, are we now hearing that executive authority is contingent on domestic obedience? Someone actually laughed, short and sharp, not amused. My father's wife opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing too late that no one in that room cared who she was. This wasn't a living room. It was a battlefield made of contracts and reputations. The attorney asked for a brief recess. People stood, phones came out, quiet conversations exploded like cracks in ice. I stayed seated. My father pulled me aside, his face red now, not from anger, from panic. What are you doing? He hissed. I looked at him and said, exactly what you told me to do, staying grounded. His eyes flicked around the room. Fix this, he said. Apologize. Sign. We'll talk later. I shook my head. You made it public. You made it conditional. You made it personal. I'm just respecting the boundary you set. That's when he said the thing that finally snapped something clean in me. You think you're bigger than me now? I didn't hesitate. No, I think the company is. The recess ended. Everyone sat back down. The lead attorney spoke first. Given the concerns raised, the signing will be postponed pending internal review of governance compliance. Just like that. Postponed. Not canceled. Worse. Uncertain. Investors hate uncertainty. My father tried to object, but the room had already shifted. The deal didn't vanish in a puff of smoke. It bled out slowly, painfully, in front of everyone who mattered. The meeting ended with polite smiles and sharp eyes. People shook my hand, not warmly, not coldly, carefully, like you do when you realize someone has leverage you didn't account for. My father didn't look at me as people filed out. His wife stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. I packed my folder and stood. Before I left, I leaned toward the attorney and said quietly, please note in the record that I'm willing to sign once professional boundaries are restored. She nodded. Cameras weren't rolling, but reputations were recording. That afternoon, my phone didn't stop vibrating. Board members, legal counsel, 2 investors asking for clarification meetings, HR asking for documentation of the grounding incident because apparently someone had already leaked it. By evening, the phrase CEO disciplinary overreach was floating through internal channels. By morning, it had a life of its own. My father called me at 6:12 a.m. I didn't answer. He texted, we need to talk. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't need to react to him. He had forced me into silence, and silence turned out to be power. At 9 a.m., the board requested an emergency governance review. At 11:30, The investment group formally requested assurances that executive roles would not be influenced by non-professional relationships. At 2 p.m., my father's wife resigned from her advisory position, the one no one respected but everyone tolerated. By the end of the day, my grounding had cost Apex Systems credibility, momentum, and trust. And the worst part for him was this: none of it looked like revenge. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no emotional explosion he could point to and say, "See, he's unstable." There was only process, policy, paper trails, and his own words, spoken at a party he thought didn't matter. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I realized something that would change how I handled everything going forward. Power doesn't come from pushing back harder. It comes from stepping aside and letting the structure collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. My father tried to ground me like a child. What he actually did was remove the last illusion protecting him from consequences. And the deal, the $42 million one everyone thought was the peak of his career, was now hanging by a thread he had tied himself. And the review hadn't even started yet. The governance review started quietly, the way dangerous things usually do, with calendar invites labeled routine compliance alignment and executive clarification, the kind of language that sounds harmless until you realize it exists to document everything. I was invited to all of them, not because anyone suddenly respected me, but because legally they had no choice. My father was invited too, of course, but now the dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the unquestioned authority at the head of the table. He was a variable, a risk factor being evaluated by people who measured loyalty in spreadsheets and consequences in decimals. The first meeting lasted 3 hours and covered 10 years of company structure, every amendment, every exception that had ever been made for family reasons. And with each slide that went by, I watched my father sink lower in his chair. The questions were polite but surgical. Can you clarify why the CTO's access was verbally restricted without documentation? Can you explain how personal compliance requirements intersect with executive authority? Do you consider public humiliation an acceptable management practice? That last one landed hard. My father tried to laugh it off, said it was a joke, a misunderstanding, family banter taken out of context, but the room didn't laugh with him. The room took notes. One of the outside consultants asked me directly how long similar behavior had been occurring. I answered honestly. My entire adult life. No emotion, no bitterness, just a statement of fact. That answer changed everything. Because now this wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern. And patterns scare investors more than scandals. Over the next week, emails surfaced, witnesses submitted statements, including 2 board members who had been at the party and admitted they were uncomfortable but hadn't known how to intervene. HR logged 3 anonymous complaints that suddenly didn't look anonymous at all. Legal compiled risk exposure summaries that used phrases like personal retaliation, hostile executive environment, and fiduciary breach. My father stopped calling me directly. Instead, his wife tried. She left voicemails crying, apologizing, blaming stress, blaming alcohol, blaming everyone except herself. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but because every response would have been used as evidence of reconciliation, and reconciliation would have diluted the record. Silence, again, did more work than anger ever could. By the second week, the investment group froze the deal completely. Not postponed, frozen. That word echoed through the building like a siren. $42 million sitting in limbo because one man couldn't separate his ego from governance. The board scheduled a closed session without my father present. That had never happened before. When they called me in afterward, the tone was different, cautious, respectful, almost deferential. They asked if I would be willing to remain as CTO under revised authority protections. I said yes, with conditions. Written conditions. Independent oversight. Clear separation between personal relationships and executive power. They agreed faster than I expected. That should have told me everything. The next morning, the internal memo went out. Effective immediately, Apex Systems will be implementing updated governance protocols to ensure executive autonomy and compliance integrity. No names mentioned. No blame assigned. But everyone knew. My father showed up late that day, avoided eye contact, went straight to his office, and closed the door. By lunch, the rumor mill had already rewritten the story 10 different ways, but the core remained the same. The CEO overreached. The CTO held the line. The deal suffered. By Friday, the investment group requested leadership assurances before re-engaging. They wanted stability. They wanted predictability. They wanted someone who wouldn't ground an executive over a domestic disagreement. That phrase made it into an internal summary. Quoted, in italics, my father tried one last move. He called an emergency family meeting at his house and demanded I come. I declined. He showed up at my apartment instead, unannounced, standing in the hallway like a man who had run out of places to stand tall. He didn't yell this time. He didn't posture. He asked quietly, "What do you want?" I told him the truth. I want you to stop confusing authority with ownership. I want the company protected from your impulses. And I want you to understand that grounding me didn't make me smaller. It exposed how fragile your control really was. He stared at me for a long time, then said something I never expected. I didn't think you'd do this. I answered, you never thought I could. That was the moment he realized this wasn't a phase, or rebellion, or leverage play. It was the end of an era where his word was law. The board vote came the following Monday. They didn't remove him, not yet, but they stripped discretionary powers, reassigned oversight, and installed external compliance monitoring. A soft dethroning, publicly dignified, privately devastating. The deal resumed 2 weeks later, smaller, renegotiated, with stricter conditions and reduced valuation. 31 million instead of 42. The press called it a strategic adjustment. Internally, everyone knew what it really was. The cost of humiliation. And through all of it, I stayed calm, professional, grounded in the only way that actually matters, legally, structurally, unshakable. My father tried to ground me like a child. What he did was teach an entire company what happens when power forgets it has limits. And this still wasn't the end. Because consequences don't stop at contracts. They follow you into legacy. The company no longer felt like his kingdom, it felt like neutral ground. And that shift mattered more than any title change because power doesn't disappear, it relocates, and everyone could feel it moving. The executive floor was quieter, now conversations lowered when he walked by, not out of respect, but calculation. People weren't afraid of him anymore, they were watching him. Watching to see what he'd do next, and more importantly, what would be allowed. The external monitors set up shop 2 offices down from mine, glass walls, no curtains, a constant reminder that someone was always observing. My father hated them. He called them babysitters, compliance theater, unnecessary overhead, but he never said it in writing anymore, because every sentence now lived forever. I kept my routine unchanged, early mornings, late nights, same cadence, same deliverables, because consistency is the strongest form of credibility when chaos is hunting for cracks. Investors started requesting meetings with me directly, not secretly, not rebelliously, but openly. C-suite, legal C-suite, the board framed as technical clarifications that always drifted into leadership questions. How do you see the company scaling under tighter controls? How do you manage conflict when personal relationships overlap with executive roles? How would you ensure this never happens again? I answered all of it calmly because I'd already lived the worst version of it and survived. Meanwhile, my father unraveled quietly, not explosively, not dramatically, but in the small ways that matter. He missed meetings, forgot names, repeated stories he'd already told the room he used to dominate. His wife stopped showing up to company events entirely after someone asked her if grounding executives was part of the onboarding process, and laughed before realizing no one else was laughing. HR documented that interaction too. The board scheduled another review, this one framed as succession planning, a phrase that lands like a soft pillow but suffocates all the same. I wasn't nominated officially, but I didn't need to be. The question alone was enough. Legacy isn't what you build, it's what survives you, and suddenly my father's legacy was being stress-tested in real time. Then came the audit, not financial, but cultural, anonymous surveys, interviews, exit data compiled into a report thicker than any quarterly earnings deck. The findings were brutal, polite, but brutal patterns of favoritism, blurred boundaries, unreported conflicts normalized over decades because no one thought they could challenge the founder. Until now. The report concluded with a recommendation, not a mandate, but a recommendation that leadership be restructured to ensure long-term investor confidence. That phrase hit harder than any accusation. Investor confidence is the only language that matters at that level. My father requested a private conversation with me one last time, not at home, not in his office, but in a neutral conference room, glass walls again, always the glass walls. He didn't apologize, not directly. He circled it, instead talked about pressure, expectations, how he built this company from nothing, how family sacrifices were misunderstood. I let him finish, then said something I'd rehearsed, but never expected to say out loud. You didn't lose control because of me, you lost it because you thought control meant ownership over people, not responsibility to them. He looked older in that moment, smaller, and for the first time I realized he wasn't angry, he was afraid that the story he told himself for decades was being rewritten without his permission. The next board meeting was decisive, no drama, no shouting, just votes and minutes and outcomes. He was asked to step back into an advisory role, emeritus status, ceremonial respect, real power gone. The announcement went out framed as a visionary transition, a founder choosing to empower the next generation. The market responded positively, stock up 3% by close. The deal stabilized partnerships, renewed, new talent applied, citing clear governance culture as a draw. I stayed CTO, but my role expanded, unofficially at first, then formally, with added authority lines reporting directly to the board on technical and operational integrity. My father didn't attend the announcement meeting. He sent a congratulatory email drafted, carefully reviewed by legal, CC to the right people, signed with his full name, not dad, not founder, just Robert Young. I replied professionally, thanked him, acknowledged his contributions, and moved on. That was the final boundary. Not anger, not revenge, just structure. The most expensive grounding in West Coast corporate history didn't end with a signature or a deal. It ended with a lesson written into policy, precedent, and memory. Power that humiliates eventually isolates itself. Authority that demands submission eventually answers to accountability. And sometimes the quietest response is the one that echoes the longest. Didn't feel like victory, it felt like aftermath, and aftermath is where truth settles. The press cycle moved fast. One day speculation, the next day certainty, headlines softened by PR language, but sharp enough for anyone paying attention. Founder steps back, company enters new era, board cites stability, markets respond positively. What never made the article was the tension inside the building, the way people exhaled without realizing they'd been holding their breath for years. Engineers started speaking up in meetings, product managers stopped glancing at the door before disagreeing, finance stopped routing everything through one personality. Culture doesn't change with speeches, it changes when fear leaves the room. My days got longer, not because I wanted control, but because systems neglected for years suddenly needed daylight. Approvals that had been personal favors now required process. Documentation that had lived in someone's head needed to be written, tested, defended. I didn't rush it because rushed reform looks like revenge, and I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in durability. My father stayed away at first, then tried to re-enter through commentary, emails, suggestions framed as advice, reminders of how things used to be done. I read them all, responded to some, forwarded others to governance committees, not to punish, but to place them where they belonged, ideas without authority. That distinction mattered. His wife attempted once to come back into the orbit through a charity initiative tied to the company brand, and for the first time HR said no without asking anyone else. That was the moment I knew the shift was real, because systems had started protecting themselves. At home, silence replaced conflict, no late night calls, no dramatic texts, just absence, and absence can be louder than shouting. I didn't fill it. I focused on work, on rebuilding trust with people who'd been collateral damage for years. One afternoon, an engineer who'd been there since the early days stopped by my office and said quietly, "I didn't think this place could change, but it did, and you didn't even raise your voice." That mattered more than any title. The board finalized succession plans, not naming names, but outlining criteria, transparency, accountability, emotional separation from authority. It was the kind of document that outlives egos. Investors stopped asking if things were stable and started asking how fast we could grow again. That's the real signal. When fear leaves, money follows. My father sent one last message months later, not about the company, but about himself. Said he was learning how to be quiet, how to listen, how to exist without command. I didn't respond right away because healing doesn't need witnesses. When I did reply, it was brief, respectful, and final. "I hope you find peace outside of power." That was it. No closure speech, no reconciliation arc, just reality. The most expensive grounding wasn't the deal or the stock or the role. It was the cost of confusing authority with entitlement. Some people learn that lesson early, others only when the room stops laughing and starts watching. And if there's one thing I learned, it's this: power doesn't vanish when you step back, it reveals who you were when you had it. When leadership changes, people imagine a clean break, a before and after slide, but real transitions feel like excavations. You dig and keep finding layers you didn't know existed. The first internal audit report landed on my desk late on a Sunday night, I remember, because the building was quiet and the city outside my window looked indifferent, which somehow made it worse. It wasn't criminal, nothing cinematic, no handcuffs, no sirens, just years of informal approvals, undocumented overrides, verbal green lights that bypassed risk models because one person said, "Trust me." That phrase appeared more than once in meeting notes: "Trust me," as if trust were a policy. I didn't sleep that night, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing how close we'd come to a single point of failure collapsing everything. Monday morning, I called the heads of compliance, finance, security, and engineering into a room and said one sentence: "We fixed this without blame, but with honesty." Some nodded, some stiffened, a few looked relieved, like they'd been waiting for permission to admit things weren't fine. That's how Rot survived silence. The days that followed were long and unglamorous: rewriting charters, mapping approvals, separating founder privilege from operational necessity. We found contracts that had been renewed out of habit, vendors chosen because they were friends, spouses, cousins, acquaintances, orbiting influence like moons. Ending those relationships wasn't dramatic, it was procedural, but procedure feels like rejection when you're used to exceptions. Phones rang, old allies asking for favors, reminding me of dinners, laughter, shared history. I listened, I thanked them, and I said no. Each no felt like pulling a splinter that had been in the skin too long, pain, then relief. Internally, morale shifted slowly, then all at once. Engineers stopped whispering, legal stopped hedging, HR stopped asking if something would upset someone and started asking if it was right. That's when culture turns, not with slogans, but with permission. My father tried once more to intervene, indirectly through a board ally, suggesting I was overcorrecting, that the company had grown because of flexibility. I responded with data: churn reduced, incidents down, onboarding time improved, retention climbing. Flexibility without accountability isn't innovation, it's risk dressed as charisma. The ally backed off. Investors noticed too. The questions changed from who's really in charge to what's the roadmap. We announced a new governance framework, not flashy, just clear lines, roles, checks. The market liked it. Stability sells better than bravado. At home, the personal side lagged behind, change always does. Family members split camps, some quietly supportive, others resentful, as if I'd broken an unspoken rule that sons don't outgrow fathers publicly. I didn't argue. The argument assumes shared definitions of loyalty, and ours were never aligned. One evening, weeks later, I ran into an old family friend at a grocery store. He said, "Your dad used to talk about you like you were his legacy, not a person." I thanked him for the honesty and realized that grounding comment at the party hadn't been about discipline, it had been about control slipping and fear looking for an audience. Power hates silence, it needs laughter, agreement, noise. When it doesn't get it, it panics. Professionally, the company moved forward, a major product launch, hit on time, clean metrics, strong reviews. The press credited the team, not a single personality, which felt right. I declined interviews, focused on leadership drama, and redirected attention to engineering wins. Attention is a resource you can allocate or hoard. I chose allocation. Months passed, and the absence of crisis became the headline. Internally, meetings ended on time, decisions stuck, follow-through happened. People stopped asking if they could speak and just spoke. That's freedom in an organization. I wrote one last internal memo near the end of the quarter. It was short and plain: authority is borrowed, trust is earned, and process protects both. No signatures, no flourish. I saved the rest for myself, a private note that said, "You didn't raise your voice, you didn't apologize for existing, you didn't trade dignity for approval." The most expensive grounding wasn't the money or the deal, it was the lesson that respect doesn't come from titles, it comes from restraint. And sometimes the strongest move isn't to argue back, but to walk forward quietly and let the room catch up. 2 weeks after the contract fallout, the board scheduled an offsite, not the kind with team-building exercises and trust falls, but the kind with binders, thick agendas, and closed doors. I walked in knowing exactly what was at stake: not my job, not my title, but the narrative of what had happened and who would be allowed to tell it. My father wasn't there officially, he'd resigned from any advisory role, but his presence hung in the room through people he'd mentored, favors he'd done, careers he'd influenced. Influence doesn't disappear when a name is removed from a slide. It lingers in habits and deference, in the way people phrase objections softly when they shouldn't. The chair opened with a summary, calm, neutral words that tried to compress weeks of tension into bullet points. I listened and waited, because timing matters more than volume. When it was my turn, I didn't rehash the party or the grounding or the humiliation. That story was tempting but useless. I talked about controls, about continuity, about what happens when authority is personal instead of institutional. I showed timelines, metrics, deltas, before and after. I showed how quickly confidence returns when clarity replaces charisma. Some nodded, some took notes, one stared at the table like it might open. Then questions came, sharp ones, about risk exposure, about legacy contracts, about whether the market would read this as instability. I answered without defensiveness, because defensiveness smells like guilt. We discussed succession planning, not for me, but for everyone, because systems that survive only one person aren't systems, they're bets. The vote was unanimous to formalize the changes, permanent, not interim. No applause, just pins moving, which felt right. Afterward, in the hallway, one director pulled me aside and said quietly, "This couldn't have happened if you'd shouted." People confuse noise with strength. That stuck. Back at the office, the ripple reached teams I hadn't touched directly: procurement reset vendor lists, engineering standardized release gates, sales stopped promising features without tickets. The company felt like it exhaled. With stability came curiosity. Employees asked why certain things were the way they were and proposed better ones. That's how innovation actually happens, not with slogans, but with safety. Outside the building, the story evolved. 2 blogs speculated about a founder's fall: grace narratives, love arcs, and villains. I didn't correct them, because attention feeds myths, and myths complicate work. Inside, I focused on people who'd been overlooked under the old regime, the quiet performers, the ones who'd been told, "Wait your turn," while exceptions leapt ahead. Promotions followed, not as rewards, but as alignments. The culture document was rewritten not by me, but by a cross-functional group that argued over verbs for 2 days. That argument mattered more than any keynote. Family pressure flared again when the board decision leaked. My father called late, not angry, tired. He said, "You could have handled this privately." I said, "I tried." He said, "You embarrassed me." I said, "The deal did that, not me." Silence stretched long enough to be honest. He said, "You always were stubborn." I said, "You always confused obedience with respect." The line ended without resolution, and I let it be unresolved, because some conversations only end when one person stops trying to win them. Weeks turned into months. The deal was restructured, smaller, cleaner, with safeguards that made lawyers smile and engineers sleep. Investors returned, cautious then confident. Revenue stabilized then grew, not explosively, but sustainably, which is another word people forget. I instituted a rule: no public reprimands ever. Correction happens in rooms with doors and witnesses who can help, not crowds who can only judge. That rule came from a memory I didn't share. At an all-hands, someone asked if the company would ever bring my father back in any capacity. The room held its breath. I said, "We honor contributions, and we protect the future. Those are different responsibilities, and they don't always overlap." No boos, no cheers, just acceptance. That's when I knew the grounding story had lost its grip internally. It had become background noise. Personally, I changed too, not dramatically, just deliberately. I stopped explaining myself to people, committed to misunderstanding. I stopped preempting criticism by shrinking. I learned to let pauses exist in conversations, because pauses reveal motives. I learned that saying "all right" can be a complete sentence if it's followed by action. On the anniversary of the party, I hosted a small dinner, not to commemorate anything, but to gather people who'd carried weight quietly. No speeches, no toasts, just food and conversation. Someone joked about being grounded and laughed, and then stopped apologetically. I smiled, because the joke had lost its edge. Power that needs ridicule to survive isn't power. Late that night, alone in the office, I walked past the conference room where the deal had almost died. The table polished, the chairs aligned. I imagined the version of me who might have stormed and argued, shouted, demanded apology. That version would have lost, even if it felt good for a minute. The version who walked in calmly with a badge and a plan won, because he didn't need permission. The most expensive grounding wasn't a punishment, it was an invitation to choose a different axis. I chose process over pride, patience over performance, control over chaos. And the cost, while high, was less than the price of staying small to keep someone else comfortable. The morning after the board vote, I arrived early, not to posture, but to read every message I'd ignored while the company held its breath. Vendors wanting clarity, employees wanting reassurance, reporters wanting a quote, family wanting access. I answered none of the last category because boundaries aren't loud, they're consistent. Inside the building, a new ritual formed organically. Teams posted weekly risks on a shared board, not to shame, but to surface them before they hardened. It was messy at first, honest friction always is. A senior engineer admitted a dependency risk that would have been buried before. Sales flagged a promise they couldn't keep, and engineering thanked them instead of rolling eyes. That moment mattered more than any KPI. Culture changes when telling the truth stops being punished. I spent days in rooms listening more than speaking because leadership after a rupture isn't about charisma, it's about capacity. Can you absorb anxiety without amplifying it? Can you translate uncertainty into options? Can you say we don't know yet and still be trusted? Those skills aren't taught, they're earned by staying present when answers are thin. The market noticed not the gossip, but the steadiness. Analysts revised notes from cautious to constructive. One wrote management discipline improved materially, which is analyst language for adults are back in the room. The restructured deal closed quietly weeks later without the cameras my father loved, and that was a feature, not a bug. When the wire hit the account, there was no applause, just a few nods, and people going back to work. That's what winning looks like when you're building, not performing. Then came the audits, not punitive, but preventative. We invited them. Transparency isn't a confession, it's a strategy. The auditors found gaps, not scandals, the kind you can fix if you don't hide them. We fixed them and documented how so no one had to remember favors to get exceptions. Meanwhile, the external story mutated. Blogs tired of the narrative pivoted to new villains. Silence starves myths. I learned that restraint is a form of leverage. Privately, my father kept circling through intermediaries, old colleagues, mutual friends, people who thought they were helping by carrying messages. I declined meetings politely, repeatedly. When you explain your no, you teach people how to negotiate around it. Eventually, the messages stopped. The company rolled out a mentorship program inverted from the usual ladder. Juniors chose seniors, not the other way around. Accountability flipped, and with it, behavior. I watched managers prepare differently, knowing feedback would be public upward. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. People grew faster when flattery stopped working. One afternoon, a junior PM stopped me in the hallway and said, "I thought leadership meant having the loudest voice. Now I think it means making space." That was the line I replayed on hard days. Hard days still existed: a missed deadline, a client churn, a hiring freeze scare. None of it broke us because resilience is cumulative, not reactive. We had muscles we hadn't had before. At home, I slept better, not because things were easy, but because they were honest. I stopped replaying conversations at night. I stopped drafting imaginary arguments. Peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the absence of pretending. The anniversary of the deal passed without ceremony. Instead, we shipped a release on time with fewer bugs than any prior quarter. The email thread was boring, congratulations, thanks emojis. Boring is beautiful when the alternative is chaos. Then an unexpected test arrived, a regulator inquiry triggered by an anonymous tip, likely someone nursing an old grievance. The team didn't panic. We pulled records, responded on schedule, invited follow-ups. The inquiry closed with recommendations we'd already implemented. That moment proved the system worked even under stress. Later that week, a journalist finally caught me in an elevator and asked if I felt vindicated. The word felt wrong. Vindication implies a trial. I wasn't interested in winning. I said I felt responsible. Responsibility is heavier, but it keeps you upright. Inside the company, we marked a year since the restructuring with a day of learning, not celebration, workshops taught by employees on topics they cared about. A designer taught negotiation through typography. An ops lead taught crisis planning through cooking. Laughter returned, not nervous, but earned. At the end, someone asked what grounding taught me. I said consequences teach faster than lectures, and that quiet choices outlast loud declarations. After hours alone, I considered reaching out to my father, not to reconcile, but to inform. I drafted messages, deleted them. You don't reopen doors just to prove you can close them gently. Weeks later, he sent a note, handwritten, 3 sentences, no apology, just an acknowledgement that the company looked stable and that stability mattered. I replied with a thank you and nothing else. Sometimes mutual recognition is the maximum outcome available, and insisting on more is vanity. As year 2 began, the board asked me to propose a 5-year vision. I didn't bring a deck full of moonshots. I brought principles with examples. Build products people can trust. Hire adults who argue well. Document decisions so power can be audited. Share credit widely. Fail in daylight. The board approved unanimously. One director said this reads like a constitution. Exactly, I said constitutions matter when personalities fade. On a random Tuesday, I overheard someone joking about being grounded again, and everyone laughed because the phrase had lost its sting. Language heals when power shifts. I realized the story people tell about you eventually becomes the story they tell about themselves. Ours had changed from spectacle to stewardship. That's the work. That's the part no one claps for. And that's how the most expensive grounding kept paying dividends long after the laughter stopped. A closed-door session titled Governance Review, No Press, No Guests, No Theatrics. Inside that room were people who had survived enough cycles to recognize when ego costs more than it produces. We didn't relitigate the past because the past had already invoiced us and been paid. We talked about controls not as shackles, but as scaffolding, the kind that lets you build higher without falling. Someone asked if we were overcorrecting. I answered that overcorrection is temporary, but undercorrection compounds. The minutes reflect that line because words matter when memories fade. Afterward, I walked the floor not to be seen, but to listen. An engineer told me they'd stopped polishing demos and started polishing logs because reliability finally mattered more than applause. A salesperson admitted they felt safer saying no to bad deals. Safety is underrated in performance cultures until you see what fear does to truth. That afternoon, an acquisition rumor spiked our mentions. We said nothing. Silence again did the work. When the bidder sent feelers, we responded with a structured process and evaluation anchored in fundamentals, not vanity. They balked. Good. If you can't say no, you don't own anything. In parallel, we formalized succession planning not because I planned to leave, but because institutions rot when continuity depends on one voice. I appointed deputies publicly with real authority and watched how rooms changed when power wasn't a rumor. Some people rose, some self-selected out. Both outcomes were healthy. A month later, the quarterly all hands arrived. I spoke briefly, then invited questions uncapped. Someone asked about my father. The room held its breath. I said family relationships are private, but professional boundaries are public and ours are firm. Then I pivoted to metrics and thanked teams by name. We moved on. Moving on is a skill. The market rewarded predictability, not drama. A client who'd paused reactivated with a larger commitment, citing governance improvements as the reason. Another insisted on meeting me personally, not to test authority, but to confirm alignment. I brought the team instead. Alignment is plural. Meanwhile, the old social circles adjusted. Invitations thinned, then reappeared, framed differently. People respect lines once they realize you won't redraw them for convenience. One dinner, a guest joked about the grounding story again, and I watched the table recalibrate when I didn't bite. Stories need oxygen. Starve them, and they turn into trivia. At work, we launched a red team exercise simulating a crisis worse than anything we'd faced. We failed parts of it on purpose to see how fast truth surfaced. It surfaced faster than before. That's progress. The debrief was candid without blame. Someone said this feels grown up. Exactly. On a personal level, I reclaimed routines I'd abandoned during the noise: morning runs, cooking without checking email, reading books that weren't about leverage. Clarity improves when your nervous system isn't hijacked. I stopped drafting speeches in my head. I stopped imagining rebuttals. Peace again, but sturdier this time, because it was built on choices, not avoidance. Then came the unexpected apology, not from my father, but from an executive who'd laughed at the party and later tried to minimize it. He said I didn't understand then, and I'm sorry. I accepted it without ceremony because accountability should feel normal, not heroic. Weeks later, he recommended a process change that saved us millions. People grow when you let them without making it about you. As year-end approached, we faced a downturn. Orders slowed, budgets tightened. We cut expenses early and transparently, preserving jobs where possible and explaining trade-offs plainly. Trust carried us through the lean months. When growth returned, it returned cleaner. At the holiday gathering, we skipped speeches entirely and funded a bonus pool tied to team goals, not executive discretion. Someone asked if this was my style now. I said it's our style. Language again. In the final board meeting of the year, a director summarized what had changed. You turned a spectacle into a system. That sentence felt accurate. Systems outlive moments. On the walk home, I thought about the party, the laughter, the word grounded thrown like a toy meant to humiliate. Toys break. Systems don't. And that's how part 9 ended, not with a mic drop, but with a checklist completed and another started, because the work continues long after the story stops being interesting. The weeks after that signing became something I didn't expect. Quiet, not peaceful exactly, but controlled, like the hum of a machine finally tuned correctly. My father stopped calling entirely, which told me more than any apology ever could, because silence from someone who survives on authority is not absence, it's defeat. Meanwhile, the board stopped asking me whether I was ready and started asking me what I wanted to prioritize next. That shift is subtle if you've never lived inside power structures, but once you feel it, you never forget it. Readiness is something they ask children and subordinates. Direction is something they ask leaders. I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne moment, no victory dinner. I went home that night and slept for 10 straight hours for the first time in years. The kind of sleep where your body finally believes it's safe. The kind that doesn't come from exhaustion, but from certainty. The next morning, I woke up to 30 emails marked urgent. None of them dramatic, all operational. Budgets, approvals, vendor renegotiations, compliance updates. Real work. And I smiled because this is what winning actually looks like. Boring leverage, repeatable control, systems that move whether or not anyone is clapping. Inside the company, something else shifted too. People stopped whispering when I walked by, not because they were afraid, but because they didn't need to. The uncertainty had evaporated. Clarity is louder than fear. One senior engineer stopped me in the hallway and said something I still think about. I've worked under 5 executives. You're the first one who doesn't need to remind the room who you are. I didn't respond. I just nodded. Because anything I said would have cheapened it. The press cycle died faster than expected. Drama doesn't last when there's no counterpunch, no emotional follow-up, no messy quotes. I refused every invitation to tell my side. Because my side was already signed into law. Ink dries louder than words. Eventually, even the blogs moved on to fresher scandals, younger egos, louder collapses. That's the thing about restraint. It starves spectacle. At home, the ripple effects were slower. Extended family tested the waters through indirect messages. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years suddenly checking in. Old friends of my father's suddenly interested in coffee. I declined politely every time, not out of spite, but because proximity is a privilege, and I had finally learned to price it correctly. Access without alignment is just another liability. One evening, I received an internal report I hadn't requested. A risk analysis prepared by legal on executive interference scenarios. Page 12 outlined reputational exposure related to familial governance conflicts. My father's name appeared once, clinically, unemotionally, as a historical factor, not a current risk. I stared at that sentence longer than I expected. Because being downgraded to history is the one thing control addicts never recover from. The irony is that once the threat evaporated, I stopped thinking about him entirely. Resentment requires proximity. Distance turns even trauma into data. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something cleaner, finality, the kind that doesn't need validation. Quarterly earnings came in ahead of projection, not dramatically, but consistently. Analysts used words like stable and disciplined, which in this market is code for dangerous in the best way. Internally, we expanded security authority, restructured data governance, quietly sunset a product line my father had championed for ego reasons years earlier. Nobody fought me on it. Numbers don't argue. I started mentoring 2 directors who reminded me of myself before I learned to go quiet, smart, reactive, still thinking speed equals power. I told them the same thing every time. Never confuse motion with leverage. Never confuse being loud with being right. One of them wrote it down, the other just listened. Both will be fine. The last contact from my father came months later. Not a call, not a demand, but a forwarded invitation to a private industry gala he had once treated like a throne room. His message was one line. They still think I matter there. I didn't respond, because power that has to announce itself is already gone. And I wasn't interested in reopening a closed chapter just to reassure someone who had mistaken authority for immortality. By the end of that year, Apex wasn't just solvent. It was respected, the kind of respect that doesn't trend, doesn't spike, doesn't collapse overnight, the kind that survives leadership changes and market cycles, the kind built quietly, by people who don't need grounding or permission or applause. And here's the part people always expect next: reconciliation, closure, some emotional reckoning. But there wasn't one. There was only momentum. And that's the truth nobody sells because it doesn't fit a headline. Sometimes the ending isn't loud. Sometimes the ending is simply that the world keeps moving, just no longer around the people who try to stop you. By the time the next annual shareholder meeting arrived, the atmosphere around Apex Systems had fully recalibrated, the kind of shift you don't see on balance sheets but feel in the way people enter a room, shoulders back instead of hunched, conversation stopping not out of fear but respect. The company had stopped orbiting a personality and started orbiting execution, which is always the moment when real power settles in. I stood at the back of the auditorium as people filtered in, 600 seats filled slowly, methodically, the way institutional money moves, no excitement, just certainty. I watched board members greet one another with restrained nods instead of forced smiles. Watched investors flip through printed packets they trusted would match what they were about to hear. Trust is quiet like that. It doesn't need to be sold. When I finally walked to the stage, the room didn't erupt. There was no standing ovation, just attention, full and undivided, which is infinitely more dangerous. I opened with numbers, not stories, margins, risk exposure, growth vectors, regulatory posture. Every slide deliberately boring, because boring is what convinces people you're not lying. And halfway through I noticed something that almost made me lose my place. My father wasn't there. Not in the front row, not in the shadows, not pretending to whisper influence into someone else's ear, gone entirely, erased from the environment he once dominated. I paused for half a second longer than necessary, then continued, because absence doesn't need commentary. It speaks for itself. After the meeting, a senior investor pulled me aside, a woman who'd been in tech longer than I'd been alive. She said, "You're not like him." Not accusatory, not curious, just observational. And I said, "I know." And she smiled like someone watching a problem solve itself. That night, I walked home instead of taking a car, something I hadn't done in years, not for safety reasons, but because movement grounds thought. And as I crossed 3 familiar blocks, I realized something uncomfortable and freeing. I no longer knew what version of me my father hated, because I wasn't performing against him anymore. Rivalry requires an audience, and I had left the theater entirely. Emails from recruiters started coming in, not job offers exactly, but conversations, the corporate equivalent of flirtation. I ignored most of them, not because I was loyal, but because I was finally positioned exactly where leverage compounds fastest, inside a system I could shape long-term. Leaving too early is just another kind of impatience. One afternoon, HR forwarded me a formal complaint, not about me, but involving my father. Apparently, he had attempted to leverage his last remaining contacts to interfere with a vendor relationship, name-dropping authority he no longer had. The vendor documented everything and sent it directly to compliance. I read the report once, closed it, and approved the response. No engagement, no escalation, just a quiet cease and desist. Watching someone try to exert power they no longer own is like watching a hand reach for a railing that's already been removed. The strangest part was how little emotion it triggered. No anger, no satisfaction, just data, the way a doctor reads a chart after a condition has stabilized. This is what people don't understand about growth. The real shift isn't confidence, it's detachment, caring less not because you're numb, but because you're finally focused on the right variables. Internally, leadership dynamics continued evolving. People stopped asking me what my father thought, stopped referencing legacy decisions as untouchable, stopped hedging when they spoke to me. One director admitted during a strategy session, "We used to design plans around what he wouldn't approve," and I replied, "Design them around what survives scrutiny." And the room nodded because everyone felt the difference. At home, my life simplified dramatically, not in the minimalist influencer sense, but structurally. Fewer conversations, fewer obligations, fewer explanations. I stopped attending events where my presence was transactional, stopped answering messages that began with nostalgia instead of accountability. Time is the one asset you can't reallocate once it's spent, and I was done investing it in ghosts. Months later, I received an envelope forwarded through legal, handwritten address, no return label. Inside was a single-page letter from my father, not angry, not apologetic, just confused. He wrote about not recognizing the industry anymore, about being sidelined, about people forgetting who built things. There was no mention of grounding, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just grievance wrapped in nostalgia. I folded it once, placed it back in the envelope, and archived it, not because it mattered, but because documentation is how you close loops without reopening wounds. What surprised me most was how others reacted to his disappearance. There was no mourning, no vacuum, no chaos. The system didn't collapse, it stabilized. And that realization landed heavier than any confrontation ever could. Authority that depends on fear leaves nothing behind. Authority that builds structure leaves continuity. By the time the next fiscal year began, Apex announced its expansion into 3 new markets. Not flashy launches, just infrastructure, compliance frameworks, hiring pipelines, the kind of moves that look dull in press releases but reshape industries quietly. I signed every major document myself, deliberately, clause by clause, never delegating signature authority, because ink carries memory, and I wanted mine everywhere. I caught myself smiling once during a routine audit, not because it was going well, but because nobody in the room questioned my presence, nobody tested my legitimacy, nobody waited for someone else to overrule me. Power had normalized, and that normalization was the real victory. Late one night, after a long board dinner, one of the newer directors asked me something carefully. "Do you ever worry you'll become him?" It wasn't an insult. It was a fear disguised as curiosity, and I answered honestly. Only if I stop listening. Only if I start confusing obedience with respect. She nodded, relieved, because leaders who can articulate their own failure modes are the ones you can trust. The irony of the original grounding finally surfaced then. Grounding is meant to immobilize, to remove access, to shrink someone's world. But what he'd done instead was disconnect me from a system that fed his control, grounding me not in obedience, but in autonomy. Sometimes the punishment reveals the escape route. Toward the end of that year, I was invited to speak at a closed executive forum. No press, no recordings, just a room full of people who had all survived power struggles of their own. Someone asked what lesson I'd learned navigating legacy authority, and I said something that felt truer than anything rehearsed. Never confuse inheritance with entitlement, and never confuse fear with loyalty. The room was silent for a moment. Then someone laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was accurate. I didn't see my father again that year, not in public, not through intermediaries, not in dreams either, which was the real sign that the chapter had ended. Unresolved stories haunt sleep, resolved ones fade into background noise. As the year closed, Apex Systems posted its strongest retention metrics in a decade. Turnover dropped, internal promotion increased, employee surveys showed something rare: trust in leadership, not excitement, not devotion, trust, the kind that doesn't evaporate when things get hard. I read the report alone in my office, lights dimmed, city glowing below, and realized that whatever had begun as humiliation had ended as foundation. And this wasn't the ending yet, because endings only come when momentum stops, and mine was still accelerating. But for the first time, acceleration didn't feel like running, it felt like direction. It ended the way most real power stories end, quietly, without applause, without confrontation, without anyone asking permission. Because the people who win long-term don't announce it. They just stop being available for nonsense. The final shift came on a Tuesday afternoon that looked completely ordinary from the outside. No meetings canceled, no urgent calls, no raised voices, just an email from legal marked informational. I opened it expecting routine compliance language, and instead found confirmation that my father's last remaining advisory contract had been formally terminated, not by us, not by pressure, but by irrelevance. The client had moved on, the market had adjusted, and no one had bothered to ask him for input again. That was it. No dramatic fallout, no public disgrace, no revenge arc, just a system correcting itself once the noise was removed. And for the first time I understood something I'd never fully grasped before. Power doesn't need to destroy what came before it. It only needs to outgrow it. A week later, Apex finalized the acquisition that had been postponed during the chaos months earlier. A clean deal. Well-structured, zero theatrics. I signed the final document in my office alone, not because I had to, but because I wanted to remember the feeling, the weight of responsibility without fear attached to it. The difference between control and stewardship is subtle, but it changes how your hands feel when you pick up a pen. That night, I went back to the same restaurant where the grounding had happened, not out of nostalgia, but curiosity. I sat at the bar, ordered the same drink, watched a different family celebrate something unrelated to me, and realized the place held no power anymore. Memories only hurt when they still define you. Once they don't, they're just locations. People sometimes ask now what happened between me and my father. I never give them the story they're hoping for. No courtroom drama, no explosive confrontation, no emotional monologue. I just say, we worked in different models, and let the silence do the rest. Because explaining yourself to people who want spectacle is just another form of submission. Internally, I made one final structural decision that closed the loop completely. I updated corporate governance to remove any informal legacy influence clauses, not targeting him specifically, but eliminating the concept entirely. No honorary roles, no symbolic titles, no access without function. The board approved it unanimously because everyone knew why it mattered. Organizations rot when ghosts keep voting. The last time I heard his name was months later in passing. Someone mentioned he'd started consulting independently, offering old-school leadership wisdom. I wished him well without irony. Survival isn't cruelty, it's neutrality. On the anniversary of the party, I didn't mark the date, didn't reflect, didn't commemorate anything. Instead, I spent the day onboarding 3 new engineers, listening to their ideas, watching competence replace fear in real time, which felt like the most fitting conclusion possible. Nothing symbolic, just progress. The grounding had failed in the most spectacular way possible, not because I fought it, but because I accepted it, absorbed it, and used the space it created to become ungovernable. Authority collapses fastest when it realizes the person it tried to control no longer needs to be controlled. If there's a lesson in all of this, it isn't about revenge or dominance or humiliating someone who underestimated you. It's simpler and harder than that. Never let someone who fears losing relevance decide how big your life is allowed to be. Never confuse obedience with maturity, and never underestimate what happens when you stop arguing and start positioning. I wasn't grounded that night. I was released, and the cost of that mistake didn't belong to me. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below, and don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.